En febrero de 2024 se estrenó en Netflix Rael, el profeta de los extraterrestres, o Rael, el profeta alien. Es muy poco probable que ignores qué es el movimiento raeliano o quién es Rael, si viste la serie o si escuchaste hablar del tema, pero básicamente esta es una serie documental de 4 capítulos que cuenta la historia de Claude Borilón, ex cantante, ex periodista, ex automovilista deportivo y fundador y líder a los 28 años de edad de un movimiento religioso muy grande, importante y difundido. Borilón ya era conocido como baladista cuando fue protagonista de un encuentro cercano con extraterrestres el 13 de diciembre de 1973. En ese momento él se convierte en contactado porque aseguró haber recibido un mensaje para la Tierra de estos extraterrestres, que llamaba Elohim, los que vinieron del cielo, según su traducción, que habrían llegado a la Tierra hace 25.000 años y creado al hombre a su imagen y semejanza a partir del ADN de los Elohim, que serían los padres creadores de la humanidad, ¿no? Así fue como Borilón fue nombrado embajador en la Tierra para advertir a la humanidad que entró en la era del apocalipsis por la bomba lanzada sobre Hiroshima en 1945, año en el que fue concebido en el vientre de su madre. Los Elohim anunciaron su llegada para el 2035. El objetivo del movimiento es darles la bienvenida en una embajada que se hubiese debido construir en Jerusalén, pero que es un evento que hasta la fecha no ocurrió, ni creo que ocurra. El movimiento asegura contar con 65.000 miembros y aun si la cifra fuese inexacta, el raeliano sigue siendo el movimiento religioso inspirado en ovnis más importante del mundo. A mí me gusta recordar que fue un cordobés exiliado en México, Sergio Schmuckler, el autor de la primera tesis dedicada al movimiento, Rael, Mesías del Apocalipsis, profeta tecnocrático. Sergio, que lamentablemente falleció prematuramente en el 2019, obtuvo en 1987 su licenciatura en Antropología Social por la UNAM, por la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, y nadie lo recuerda. Así que estamos haciendo esta entrevista también en su honor. Cuando estaba por estrenar la serie, me pregunté por qué no estaba entre los entrevistados Susan Palmer, que es la socióloga que conoce con más profundidad el movimiento, algo que cualquiera que googlee estudios sociales relacionados con el movimiento raeliano aparece, ¿no? La ausencia de Susan se me ocurrió un escándalo y desde ese día la idea de entrevistarla para preguntarle qué le parecía la serie, cuáles eran los aspectos relevantes de los raelianos que la serie omite, si hay tergiversaciones, bueno, fue inevitable. Por eso es el tema de esta nueva entrega de El Lado Z de la Fe de Entrevistas y además una manera de pensar en las series documentales, ¿no? Porque, claro, las series producidas por las grandes plataformas, que como todo el mundo sabe o debería saber, tienen sobre todo objetivos comerciales, buscan impacto, tienen una agenda, ¿no? Tienen una historia que contar en arreglo a objetivos que mejor no adivinar, pero a veces hay una subtrama de aspectos poco conocidos, desconocidos, mal contados, sobre los cuales vale la pena tratar de echar un poco de luz. Así que bueno, si este video te resultó interesante, no te olvides de darle me gusta, suscribirte al canal y compartir. Espero que les guste. Gracias.
Hello, Alejandro.
Hello,
María.
how are you?
Hi, how are
Fine.
you?
Finally. Bueno, por suerte la tenemos es la verdad que tenerla a Mary como traductora es un verdadero tesoro, es un verdadero honor.
I'm very happy to see you again. And Alejandro will make an introduction about who you are, what your work, things that he have read about you.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Susan Palmer es una socióloga canadiense especializada en nuevos movimientos religiosos. tal vez es la persona en el mundo que mejor conoce el movimiento raeliano. Por eso para mí fue muy sorprendente descubrir que estaba ausente en la serie de Netflix. Ella fue profesora de estudios religiosos en el Colegio Dawson, en Quebec, es profesora en la Universidad de Concordia, investigadora en la Universidad de McGill en Montreal, donde también imparte cursos sobre nuevos movimientos religiosos, y es bien conocida por sus trabajos orientados al movimiento raeliano. Por eso, y es más, le ha dedicado un libro que es Adorados Aliens, Rael, la religión OVNI de Rael, que no está traducida al castellano, Aliens, Adorados Rael's UFO Religion. Y en ese libro, bueno, documenta cómo se formó, las creencias del movimiento raeliano y también cómo los descubrimientos científicos están al servicio de la formación de la teología raeliana, muy orientada a la clonación humana. Lo que quisiera saber, la primera pregunta es, ¿cómo empezó tu interés por el movimiento raeliano, Susan?
I was interested in general in new religious movements. And I was actually, for a while, I worked as a research assistant on a project at Concordia University that was directed by Fred Bird, one of the professors in the religion studies department. And our job was to go out and visit new religious movements. And actually, we joined them because there was no ethics, research ethics going around in those days. But the Raelians, so in general, I was always on the outlook for a new religion. And I encountered the Raelians for the first time when I went to a psychic fair in Montreal, where there were, tarot card readers, Wiccans, that sort of thing. And I saw these men wearing swastikas inside the Star of David with long hair, wearing white, and there were pictures of UFOs behind them, posters of UFOs. And I went up to talk to them, and they asked me if I wanted to enter a raffle, a sort of competition, where if you answered the questions correctly, they would come to your house and tell you about the message. So my friend and I both entered the competition, and the questions were very easy, all about does the sun revolve around the moon or vice versa, things like that. And so the next morning I got a phone call, congratulations, you're the winner. We're going to come to send a guide to your house. So I phoned my friend and I said, guess what, I won. And he said, well, so did I, Susan. Don't you get it? So I began to take my students to their meetings because they were very open to being studied. And in fact, one of the chapters in my book is all based on student research.
Tu idea para conocer tu impresión sobre el movimiento raeliano de una manera muy resumida. Hoy, ¿qué dirías, ¿no?, sobre el movimiento raeliano, en pocas palabras?
It used to be a small movement in Montreal. It was this headquarters of the world, and Rael was always usually at the meetings, and I could sit right behind him in the guides and try to eavesdrop. And several times I got to speak to him. I guess one thing that I found very interesting was they're materialists. They don't believe in, a transcendental God or life after death or a soul. So they claim that science is their religion. But of course, what they have is a religion that requires a leap of faith. And they're very interested in human consciousness, expanding human consciousness, and they have rituals. So it's very interesting to study a religion that actually is anti-religion. They're anti the Catholic Church, of course. Well, instead of having, immortality after death, they have human cloning. The body can be immortal, and the memories and the intelligence can be uploaded in the new body. So through cloning, you have the same kind of quest for immortality that you find in religion.
¿qué impresión te quedó de la serie de Netflix? ¿Cuál es tu idea, tu impresión general sobre la serie de Netflix?
I liked it very much. I thought it was better than actually the best documentary I've seen on the aliens. It was, of course, the journalistic point of view and the general, it did kind of emphasize this idea that, well, people kept saying that Rael is a liar and it's all a hoax and a fake. And the poor people who stayed in the group so long and then left, sort of their lives have been, they've lost a lot. But on the other hand, there was a lot of humor. So it was very funny. I laughed quite often. Rael came across really well. I mean, he came across to me anyway, as someone who's really enjoying life, who's very creative, who totally believes in what he's doing, and is kind of very balanced, very well balanced. And he knows how to handle criticism. He knows how to handle people. So I think he came off as a very strong person. And what amazed me about this film was that you had long-term guides who were being interviewed at the beginning, and they were talking about how beautiful and how much love there was in the movement in the early days, and why they joined and how inspiring. And then some of them, by the end of the film, you found out that they left and they were angry and they were disillusioned and they felt they'd wasted their time. And yet they still were able to say positive things about, their vision in the early days. So I thought that lent a lot of depth, and that was a very interesting thing. I've never seen that before. Also, I learned some new things that I never knew before about the movement that were pretty fascinating. For example, I found out that Brigitte Boissellier's lab assistant, the biochemist, or anyway, the biotechnician who was working in the cloning lab, he said that there was never any serious effort to do any kind of scientific work in that lab, and that what she did was simply, try to get media attention and network. Okay. And that he was really shocked when she announced they had cloned a baby, because he knew it couldn't possibly have been true. And that really surprised me, because, well, just that he was there in the lab and had noticed this. I mean, that was kind of a shock. I mean, of course, one always suspects, but I always assumed that some effort had been made.
¿Cuánto crees que le importará a Rael la confesión de Damien Marsic, así se llama el apóstata, el ex integrante de Rael?
I don't think Rael would mind the critique of the lab assistant, who's, by the way, left the movement now, because he once said that even if the clone baby didn't exist, that the whole thing had been great, because now the whole world knew about the Raelian movement and they knew about the Elohim, and it was his mandate to bring the knowledge of the Elohim to humanity. So he achieved his mission. There's something I wanted to talk about, which is what made Rael leave France, which was that media appearance, I guess you'd call it ambush journalism, where Christophe de Chavannes of Ciel-Mont Madi, the TV host, sort of brought in an ex-member who verbally attacked Rael, and he tried to create, and Christophe Deschamps, this host, tried to create the impression that Rael condoned pedophilia. And I hadn't actually seen that scene before. They showed me scenes, but not that particular bit, where Rael actually defends the freedom of speech of one of his followers who talked about how she'd been molested by her grandfather and it was great, and that, parents should, or family should. Anyway, she's implying that pedophilia, it can be a good thing. And Rael, instead of saying, no, it's terrible, he just said, well, it's freedom of expression or something like that.
Okay.
So he kind of fell into this trap. Well, there's more to the incident, though, because the man they brought in, Jean Perraga, was an ex-member who was a drug dealer, and he'd been sent to prison. And he was very jealous that his wife became involved with Aurelian Guide. So when he came out of prison, she didn't want to be with him anymore. And he was having a custody battle over the children. And he, in fact, kidnapped the children, and she had to chase him with her boyfriend and get them back. And the other thing, later on, he was arrested for running a prostitution ring that went across the Spanish border between France and Spain, and shipping Spanish women, and he went back to jail. So, I mean, he's obviously not a respectable citizen. Like in the, on the program, he looks like this concerned father, he was actually a pretty crazy guy.
En la serie no se proporciona todo este contexto para comprender que esa escena fue una emboscada y quién era esta persona, ¿no?
Exactement. Yes. And the other thing is, they gave you the impression that the reason Rael left was because of this TV program. And of course, that was one of the reasons. But the main reason he left is because they had this tax on religious books. So if you're in a religion, for example, even in a religion, if you sell books, there's a 60% tax. So Rael would have had to pay this huge tax on the sale of his books, and he was in arrears. He owed for years and years, and then they put extra tax for him, to punish him. So he owed so much money that he just left France, and he can never go back. Okay. So that's the real reason he left. The other thing I wanted to mention was, oh yes, the reason he left Quebec in the film was because these two journalists infiltrated the summer camp and did a big expose on the Raelian movement. And you see one of these journalists, Bridget McCann, her name is, she's talking about how, he's a master manipulator, and they just have this lie about the cloned baby, and that everything is lies, and that all these people believe this absolute nonsense, and it's dangerous. But the thing is, you could say exactly the same thing about a summer camp for the Catholic Church, because, I mean, you could say they preach, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Virgin Mary was a virgin when she gave birth. It's all stuff that is not scientifically possible, but they don't accuse, the Catholics of lying, so that they just don't take the Raelians seriously as a religion. Obviously, their ideas are irrational because they're religious, but that doesn't mean they're a, quote, evil cult. So I found her attitude, she had a very militant, secular attitude, which is typical in Quebec, this journalist. And it wasn't mentioned that the two journalists were sued by the Raelian movement because they took photographs of people in the nude, which were published with their names and place of work, and they were exposed, Okay. And a lot of people, as a result of this, the media that came out in the Journal de Montréal, they lost jobs, they lost professional opportunities, they were publicly embarrassed and humiliated. So when they sued Bridget McCann and the other woman who took the photos, and they also sued the Journal de Montréal, they won their case. They won, like, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So she was found guilty of, she didn't ask people's permission to photograph them. She did it in secret. She publicized personal information that damaged their careers. And so naturally, she lost the case. And I think this should have been mentioned, in the film, in the documentary.
Una pregunta que no puedo dejar de hacer tiene que ver con la elección del especialista para acompañar el desarrollo de la serie, ¿no? Eligieron a un denunciante como el especialista que va relatando y dando un marco a todo lo que se cuenta, ¿no? en la serie. Eso a mí me pareció bastante significativo para entender cuál es la agenda de la serie, ¿no? ¿A vos te parece significativo esto? Que esté esta persona y que no estés vos, por ejemplo.
Well, I don't mind at all that I wasn't chosen because I'm really tired of being interviewed by, well, of course, I do it because Alejandro's my friend and you're my friend, but I'm really tired of being interviewed about the Raelians just because I wrote a book on them, because I have studied so many other groups. And in fact, I stopped studying the Raelians when the book came out, in 2004. So, and also I've noticed that journalists, well, filmmakers, they don't really like what we call talking heads, academics who blah, blah, blah about, Max Weber's theory of charisma and things. They find that boring. So often they cut you out. Like I've been interviewed so many times, like on a documentary about the solar temple, which I would have loved to be in. And they just cut me out, So because I'm a boring talking head, it's like, what can you do? So in fact, I was in a documentary called Rael au Québec, which is about the early days of the Raelians in Quebec, made by a Quebec filmmaker. And it's very good. But I think the reason they didn't cut me out is the Raelians refused to participate. So the only people they could interview were a few ex-Raelians and a few scholars who'd studied the Raelians. And so they put a lot of emphasis on my early research with my students in the 90s, and I got to go back to UFO land and climb up and down into the UFO and look at the old, the fiberglass big arena. And so that was fun. It was like a memory trip down memories lane. So that was fun. But I mean, I didn't least mind they didn't ask me. In fact, I was interviewed for Yoav, what's his name, the other big Rael movie that came out by this Israeli filmmaker. And it was very unpleasant because he was trying to force me to say certain things. He'd prepared a script and he'd want me to insert the answer he wanted. Mm-hmm. And everything he wanted me to say was something attacking the Raelian movement, which I don't like to do because I'm supposed to be an objective social scientist, but also because I want to study the Raelians later on when, they believe the extraterrestrials are arriving. And that's another thing that I found missing in this film.
¿Qué opinas sobre el rol que jugó esta persona a lo largo de la serie, ¿no?
Because he was so enthusiastic at the beginning. He worked so hard to set up the lab, and then he was disillusioned. And then he says he hopes that Brigitte Boisselier will wake up someday. And now he's working in China. So, you feel sorry for him for working in China, but he's working in a biolab. No, I thought he was very strong. He was a very strong, and he wasn't, his criticisms weren't stupid. Like some, for example, that journalist Brigitte McCann, she sort of, her argument was, well, we didn't see any cloned babies walking around, so that means it's a canular, it's a hoax. Well, that's a stupid argument. So, I don't know, I thought he was sympathetic. The thing is with the media, or filmmakers, you always expect them. This is what they always do. They say, how can people believe this nonsense? That's their aim. Oh, they must be brainwashed and the leader must be manipulative. Well, as a religious scholar, that is just such a stupid way of looking at it. People like to believe in magical, mysterious things. People like to be in groups on a mission. And if it happens to be a new religion, which is an unfamiliar religion, then, they get condemned. But I mean, you could say people are stupid for being in a rock band for 50 years that then, doesn't last long. Or, I mean,
okay.
The thing is, I felt they were missing a lot of great stuff that as a religion scholar, I would have liked to see emphasized. Can I talk about that? Well, one thing I found really interesting is the Raelians wanting to construct an embassy and, collecting money for that. And in the film, they just saw it as a scam so that, Rael can have money in his Swiss bank account. But when I started studying the Raelians in the late 80s, they had a specific date for the end of the world. The Elohim were supposed to arrive in 2020. And then by the 90s, they changed it to 2035. No, sorry, 2025 and then 2035. So now in the film, they didn't mention this sacred date. And the embassy is supposed to be ready before the Elohim arrive. And yet in the film, people were saying, well, Rael actually said it might not be built in my lifetime. I would be surprised if it was. And then I think Brigitte Boisselier says, well, we might never build it. And that if I was there, I'd ask some tough questions. Why did you say the Elohim told you it would be 2035? And isn't this like a failure in prophecy? Isn't this like, Festinger, prophecy fails? I mean, how can you just cop out? The other thing at one time, Rael was very angry because there was a former member who gave an interview to the media saying that the money for the embassy was being misused, and that there was no serious effort to build an embassy. And then the Raelians got really upset about that, and they put more effort to find a place to build an embassy. And of course, Israel. This is really funny. I interviewed Léon Mellul, who's the Jewish member who was going to spearhead the trip to Israel to convince them to give the Raelians land to build the embassy on. And in Israel, you're not allowed to proselytize for other religions. So they weren't allowed to do anything on the street. They didn't get invited on any TV stations or radio stations. So their mission was very much unsuccessful. And after that, they started looking for other places. And they even had this brochure they gave out to every embassy in the world that threatened that if the Jews wouldn't give them land in Jerusalem, that the Elohim would withdraw their protection of the Jewish people. So I thought that was very amusing. And so anyway, there's a lot more interesting stuff about the embassy that they completely ignored. And this is also relevant. In other words, I'm interested in the apocalyptic vision of Rael.
Okay.
And giving specific dates and specific vision of the future. And this was completely ignored in the film. But in order to understand the building of the embassy, in order to understand the cloning, you have to look at in the context of Rael's apocalyptic vision.
En realidad, lo que hace la serie es cerrar enfatizando quién será el sucesor de Rael, ¿no? Como si no hubiese mucha seguridad acerca de qué va a pasar con la embajada, ¿no? Como que el acento está puesto más bien en quién será el sucesor y no qué va a pasar con la embajada.
Well, that's a very interesting issue. Rael in his second book talks about how when he went to the planet of the Elohim, he was recreated in a vat, and he saw his own body, which would be all ready to go when he died. So he knows he's immortal. I actually interviewed him on that. I said, I understand that you realize you're immortal. And he said, oh, yes, I am immortal. And so you'd think that he would be able to continue. His new body would be plunked down by the Elohim, and he could just continue on. but for some reason that doesn't seem to be, he seems to sort of admit that he won't be here someday. And then right after the big clone baby, brouhaha, he announced at one of the Raelian meetings that he would make Brigitte Boisselier his successor because she'd brought so much. So he made that promise that she would be the successor. But more recently, I talked to a guide and he said, well, what we would do is, it's like the Mormon church, all the apostles get together when one dies. Well, when the prophet dies, the apostles get together and they delegate a new member. They pray, and it's more like a vote, and so he said the guides would all get together, the bishop guides, the continental guides, and they would choose among themselves. So that's what he said, this guide. So, we have three scenarios here, and it's kind of confusing because, there's quite a few contradictions. So I really don't know what's going to happen.
En este caso, la serie está muy enfocada en la sumisión de las mujeres a Rael, ¿no? Lo ponen a él como un tipo como muy machista, como si fuese una religión muy machista, siendo el colmo o el ejemplo central el contrato de exclusividad que firma el séquito que llaman las plumas rosas. Lo que le quiero preguntar es si en las entrevistas escuchó, digamos, el tiempo en que permaneció ella moviéndose en ambientes raelianos, ¿escuchó quejas entre las mujeres que pertenecían al grupo?
No, actually I had a funny experience when I first heard about the angel order of the angels, because one of my spies in the movement sent me an email about it, and I was so excited. So I negotiated permission to go to a meeting of the angels. It was supposed to be the first meeting in Montreal with some of my students. So I was teaching a course on, quote, cults at the time, and I said, would any of you like to volunteer to go and interview these angels? And I explained, and about 10 of my students said, yes, yes. And then, unfortunately, they told their friends, and this huge crowd showed up. So we had to turn most of them away, and each angel had about 8 students asking her questions and writing notes. And it was very interesting because they all said the same thing. They'd been told what to respond. Like we said, what is your purpose? And they said, to make Rael comfortable. They all said that. And we said, what do you mean? To bring him a glass of cool water if he's thirsty. They just had identical. It was really uncanny. But they all seemed really happy and excited. And then years later, out of the blue, I got on my email these attachments called Plumes des Anges, feathers of, pink feathers. And it was, or feathers of the angel. And it was an ex-angel who was an apostate, and she wanted me to know about what went on. So they were the newsletters for 4 years, which were private, and they took a vow never to show them to anybody. And they gave me some insight into what was going on in the training. And so I actually wrote a chapter on this, and I put it in this book. I contributed to this book put out by Henrik Bogdan and James Lewis with, it was called Sexuality in New Religions or something like that. And I thought it was really fascinating. So I got to write about the secret life of the angels.
Una última pregunta y ya nos despedimos. Es, ¿en qué medida influyó el movimiento anti-israeliano que hubo en Francia en la construcción jurídica posterior que terminó criminalizando a los nuevos movimientos religiosos en Francia?
Oh, yeah. Well, as I write in my book, The New Heretics of France, I write about the government-sponsored war on cults, or sects, as they call them in France. And at the highest level of government, they have, missions to fight against sects, cults, and rescue the victims. And they have this very well, they don't consult, social science, like social scientific studies, objective studies of these groups. They just have their own fantasy about what they are. And they have this new expression now, dérive sectaire, which means cultic harm coming out of these groups. So the assumption is that if people are in these groups, bad things are going to happen, and that the leader is a master manipulator, and that people are brainwashed. So, they have this like completely unrealistic idea about what new religions are and what they do and how people join, and, all the variety of leadership, patterns you might find. And it's certainly right. The thing is, when Rael was targeted, around that time, the Solar Temple committed their first mass suicide. That was in 1994. And this was widely publicized. And the impression that cults were very dangerous and could explode at any minute and kill people was very strong. So the Raelians were actually categorized as a secte dangereuse in the Gaillard report, the 173, the list of 173 cults in France. So, they had there was a big machinery, like there were lots of raids on these groups, like tax raids. Like I wrote another book on raids, government raids with Stuart Wright, and in France they had so many raids. I mean, in fact, when I went to study the groups in, I think it was 1997, I went there, they'd all just been raided. Like every group I went, they'd had a raid, usually for tax, perquisition. And so the Raelians were, they're no exception. They were definitely targeted. Well, thank you very much, Alejandro, for having me. It was very enjoyable, and it gave me ideas, because I'm supposed to write a film review on this, on this. So it made me think about it. So it's very good. And thank you, Maria. You're a great translator. I didn't know you had that talent also. So yes, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing the finished product. Adios.
Ciao, Susan.
Ciao.
All our DNA come from them. So we can say, thank you, Elohim. Or thank you, Elohim. Everywhere.
A fait des cathédrales, des temples et puis des mosquées.